You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. In each episode, we look at how people have experienced, described, or imagined armed conflict in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which representations of war and peace can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I co-direct the Visualising War project at the University of St Andrews. For the last 6 months, I've also been coordinating a student research project on visualising peace. A lot of time and energy is spent thinking about war. Libraries and bookshops contain countless volumes of military history. Most of us can think of multiple war films. There are well-established traditions of war reporting and conflict photography. Peace, on the other hand, we talk a lot less about peace. We aspire to peace, we idealize it, but we don't spend as much time exploring and reflecting on it as we do with war. As a result, our habits of visualizing peace are often limited to quite simple cliches and well-worn tropes, images of doves or UN peacekeepers, or metaphors of friendship or seed sowing. Those images and metaphors have value and power, but they can also limit our understanding of peace as a complex, multifaceted phenomenon that's experienced and conceived very differently from one context to another. And if our understanding of peace is limited, so is our ability to build or sustain it. So for that reason, the Visualising Peace research team has been looking into the kinds of stories that individuals and communities tell about war's aftermath, conflict resolution, peace and peace building in lots of different media and lots of different places. We've also built a virtual museum of peace to spark more conversation about what peace looks like to each of us, where different kinds of peace can be found, how it can be promoted, and what peacemaking and peacekeeping actually involve. As part of this work, 2 students, Siderfin and Otilia Meden, have become particularly interested in how we visualize peace in space. Just how peaceful is space right now? How do you keep peace in space? Why is it important to invest in space security? And how can thinking about peace in space help us visualize and understand peace and peacekeeping better on Earth? To help answer some of those questions, Otilia and Harris decided to invite some experts onto the Visualising War and Peace podcast to learn more about space as a domain that's increasingly policed by military forces as well as international law. So I'm going to hand over to them to introduce themselves and their guests, and I hope you enjoy the podcast.
So hello, everyone. Welcome to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. I'm going to be one of your hosts today, Siderfin. I've been part of the Visualising Peace research group in St Andrews. And today we're going to talk about a really exciting topic. We're going to talk about space, something I've been very interested in since I was a little boy, and I'm sure everyone listening to is also very excited. The point of the Visualising Peace podcast is to try and conceptualize and think about what peace looks like, what peace is, and how it sort of comes into fruition. So we're going to talk about a really big topic today, space, so large, almost impossible to conceptualize. So we've got some experts with us today from the UK Space Command, which is the militarized area of the UK military, and then Dr. Bauer, who is a space expert as well. So I'm going to hand you over to our co-host, Otilia.
Yeah, hello everyone. So I'm Otilia, and I'm also a participant in Visualising Peace project. So our first guest today will be Dr. Adam Bauer, who is a senior lecturer in the School of International Relations. He's also a co-director of the Center for Global Law and Governance at the University of St Andrews. So currently he is undertaking a long-term research project that does assess the prospective development of new international governance mechanisms and also how to regulate military space operations. All very exciting. And Dr. Bauer is also a fellow of the Outer Space Institute, wherein he's involved in advocacy efforts relating to outer space security. And then moving on to our next guest, who is Wing Commander Sas Duffin, and she joined the Royal Air Force in 2005 as a personal support officer. And since then, she started working on the Space and Battle Space Management Force in July 2018, and is currently a qualified space instructor since February 2020. And also she has obtained a Master in Defense Studies, where she wrote on languages and narrative of space and why words matters. So that is particularly interesting to what we're going to talk about today. Very excited about your views on that. Then moving on to our final guest, who is Sqn Ldr Stu Agnew. And he has a background in corporate and commercial law. And today he serves in the Royal Air Force Legal Services since January 2016. And then furthermore, he was elected as the first legal advisor within UK Space Command following its establishment in April 2021. And today he provides legal advice on all of the command's outputs. And also he obtained a master's degree in international aviation law and regulation in 2020. And in his dissertation, he focused on the boundary between airspace and outer space under international law, or more accurately, the absence of one. So that will also be a very interesting perspective to our talk today.
Yes, hi everyone. Hi, Otilia and Harry. Thanks so much for the invitation to join this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm Adam, and background in international relations. And so most of my work has focused on sort of the politics of international law, the ways in which international law sort of develops and constrains actors. And I focused a lot on the regulation of armed violence. And in my first work was focused more on international criminal justice and conventional weapons disarmament. And over the last few years, I've become much more interested in space, partly because I think actually international relations hasn't yet really begun to grapple with the implications of space technology in the way that IR has paid a lot more attention to things like nuclear weapons, cyber technology, the advancement of drones and so forth. Space is oddly missing in some of those conversations. So I'd like to kind of contribute to that in my research. And I think this podcast is particularly fun because a lot of the IR literature, a lot of the adjacent literature in international law regarding space focuses more on the conflict rather than the cooperation. And so I think the idea that you're centering this notion of peace is a really interesting way of thinking this through. So I'm really looking forward to discussing with you and with our other experts. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Moving on to you, Sas.
Thanks very much, Otilia. Yeah, so Sas Duffin, I've been in the military now for 17 odd years. Really fell into space kind of by accident, which goes against all laws of physics, I realize that. But I came across the subject by happenstance, and I realized that I, as a human being, as a person, had almost sleptwalked into a dependence on space-enabled technology and capability without realizing. Like most people, got a smartphone, had sat-nav in my car, all of those things that you take as a technological development, but you maybe don't always think all the way through to how that has been provided for you. And I found that quite fascinating. And then the realization that there were probably an awful lot more people just like me, while recognizing that there were very few people who really knew an awful lot about space, given the relatively short time that we've been looking at it. So I developed a passion for it and decided to take my career in that sort of direction. I have been lucky enough to get some really good, strong space training and education behind me through both the US and UK military perspective. But my dissertation that I wrote for my master's was on the language and narrative of space, because you quite often find that internationally we can be talking about the same thing, but we use quite different words, and those words bring out quite different reactions from people. And then I'm hoping to go on and start my PhD research towards the tail end of this year, where I will be looking particularly, so very interested to hear Adam's points later, looking at IR, because I will be looking at the role that national culture plays in creating norms and rules of behavior in space, and how do we get those international agreements and that cooperation perspective, particularly when you have national cultures that for centuries have seemingly constantly been at odds with each other. So I'm really looking forward to see how the conversation develops.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. So moving on to the next one from the Royal Air Force, that will be you, Stu.
Hi, Otilia. Thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak. I'm really pleased to be here together with the two other panelists. I think some of the points that both speakers have said in terms of what aspects they bring, what perspective they bring, is very much tied into mine. So I think as a lawyer and a legal advisor within the military, then words definitely do matter. Narratives really do matter. And I also think how we frame the discussion is really important. And I think that's where there's going to be real benefit from today's discussion. Looking at it from the perspective of visualizing peace is really important. And it is a role that we have as a lawyer with the MOD, is really providing advice that focuses on words and focuses on how we frame cooperation, relationships, and capacity building. I would offer, I suppose, perhaps ironically, as a lawyer, I'm going to provide a disclaimer up front and a caveat up front. And certainly from our perspective, I think the views that we express are our own personal views. Certainly from my perspective, it's my own personal views. They're not necessarily representative either of the MOD or the Royal Air Force, but I will be open and as honest as I can be in expressing what my personal views are on the subject. But thank you very much.
So thank you so much. Very excited to hear all of your perspectives on this.
So I'm instantly going to go off script, which is terrible and definitely shouldn't be doing. But Saz, you're a qualified space instructor. What is that? What does that mean? Are you going to be taking me up to space? Are you flying around in space? That's the best title I've ever heard in my life. So first things first, I had to find out what that meant.
I wish it meant that I had the qualification to be able to take you up into space, because believe I'd be going there myself if I had the opportunity. It's effectively an education qualification that we have within the military. There are a number of Q patches, awards, I suppose, that you can aim for. But this particular one, it was quite arduous because I was doing it at the same time as trying to work full time. At the time, it was an 11-month course, which also involved 2 sets of month-long exercises to qualify in certain abilities. We had things like a space duty officer and a non-kinetic duty officer. And all that was doing was looking at how space could be utilized in military operations to support achieving sort of the aims that we were looking for. But I think it taught me quite quickly. I am naturally a more arts and humanities minded brain. So that the maths and science side of it, because at one point we did look at orbital mechanics and calculations such as that, which if you had told my 15-year-old self I would have been capable of doing, I probably would have laughed at you. But yeah, it's a modular course designed for personnel that we have working within more space-focused positions to effectively get them to create a tactical. I don't particularly like to use the word expert, because that almost suggests that there's a finish line to knowledge, and I don't know that we ever have that, certainly with regards to space. It's a modular training course that we have where we look to create suitably qualified and educated personnel, and those are the people, as we are growing and moving on from standing up UK Space Command only just over a year ago, really looking at how we can create a little bit more space across defence.
Sas's comment is really important, because one of the things I reflect on a bit is that space governance policy is really one of those areas that is just so inherently interdisciplinary. And it's so difficult for individuals to come to grips with the legal and the policy elements without understanding something of the physics and the science. And of course, those are disciplines that are often quite far apart. Like Sas, humanities, social science background, just trying to learn the basics of orbital mechanics felt like I was really cheating my 16-year-old self, who would have been quite offended by my sudden interest in these things. But it does speak to this real importance. And it's, by the way, this is not the only area, right? I think cyber policy is another great example of this. Environmental policy is another, where you need to bring together people that have different areas of expertise, because it really is difficult to understand, for example, as we'll discuss, the implications of what warfare or the use of kinetic or non-kinetic technologies in space means. Just very different than operating in airspace or in a naval environment, for example. And so it's just a further reflection that really strikes a chord with me, this idea of how do we individually, it's not possible to get all of the relevant expertise. So how do we bring together sort of interdisciplinary groups? And that's a real challenge, but I think it's a fun one as well, because getting to have dialogue with astrophysicists, for example, is just not something that I would have had opportunity to do in other areas of my research.
And I think that's sort of why space is so unattainable for so many people, because it's such a huge concept that, again, being an IR student, if you tell me something about thermodynamics or being in low atmosphere orbiting, I have no idea what you're talking about. You might as well be speaking a different language. But it sort of brings into this point of there are so many different actors in space. You've got space law that's being created, you've got commercial actors, you've got states, because there's so much potential and value up in the atmosphere in space. So I think that's what brings me on to my first question of, just to sort of give the listeners sort of bird's eye overview, who are the main actors in space today? How's that changed since the beginning of the space race, which would potentially have always been sort of governmental? And so who are the main actors today, and how's that going to continue to develop? And Adam, I'll sort of put that to you first.
Thanks very much, Harris. I'll try my best to do this as efficiently as I can. It's a challenge because we really are in the midst of a rapid expansion in the number of spacefaring actors. And with that, the amount of just stuff, the number of active satellites and then consequently debris that's up in orbit. I think you're right to start with states. I mean, we do that in international relations and international law. We tend to focus on states. And current estimates, I think the count is sort of somewhere around 77, 78 states have active space programs of different kinds. But of course, the capabilities, especially when you think of things like space launch, the ability to launch a rocket from one's own territory, and also the production and operation of the satellites, that's more concentrated in a more limited number of states. And so if you look at the current international regulatory filings, The United States, for example, operates or is the state of registration for about 60% of all active satellites in orbit right now. And I'll come on to why that is in a minute. China accounts for about 10%, Russia 3%, and then the European Union, Japan, and importantly for this conversation, the United Kingdom are really increasingly important actors in prominent space powers as states, and quite a large number of previously non-spacefaring states are getting into the game, often by purchasing commercial capabilities rather than developing their own indigenous space launch or satellite production capabilities. And I think that's an important part of this, right? The interface between commercial operators and states. I'm going to come back to that in a second, but it's worth noting that 100 states are now members of the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is one of the main multilateral fora for discussions, particularly on the non-military side. So looking at legal and scientific technical questions about space operations and governance. But private space companies are now really central players alongside states. But that interaction is really complex, right? It's not simply the case that these are freestanding entities entirely. Commercial space operators are now providing a huge range of missions and services. So the ones that are most developed, the ones that we would probably think of as most critical right now would be space launch. So both the rockets and the associated infrastructure. So SpaceX would be a great example of this, but there's many others that are in that game, and some of whom operating soon out of Scotland, for example. Satellite construction and their components, and then services, most especially telecommunications and remote sensing. So that's observation of the Earth through various forms. And then space situational awareness. So that's the monitoring of the orbital environment. These are all areas in which commercial operators are already making major contributions and have capabilities that in some cases are as good as, or maybe even better than, the capabilities of states other than the main leading space powers. There's also a range of emerging commercial opportunities. I think some of these are more esoteric and further away, but we're already starting to look at things like on-orbit servicing. So that would be the ability to refuel or repair a satellite when it's in orbit, something that isn't able to be done right now. Space tourism, so you can think of Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic or others like that. In-orbit manufacturing, the ability to actually produce materials in a low gravity or zero gravity environment. Fiber optic cable, for example, is a good one for the future. Debris removal, something that'll be becoming increasingly important. And then I personally think further afield, but one that gets attention is space resource extraction. So space mining from the moon or from other celestial objects like asteroids. And there's been a huge expansion of this commercial activity in recent years. So I mentioned that the United States had over, about 60% of satellites registered to the United States. Of that nearly 3,000 satellites, 85% are commercial. That is, they're operated by a commercial entity with registration through the United States. So SpaceX alone operates roughly 50% of the active satellites in orbit today, right through its Starlink constellation. So that's one actor that is accounting for 50% of the active satellites and is putting up something like near to 100 satellites a month to build out its constellation, which will eventually be 12,000 and then perhaps 20,000 satellites and beyond. But I don't want to give the impression, right, these commercial operators are really independent of states. It's actually quite the opposite. So there's a variety of these services that we could think will increasingly be for commercial end users. So, you can buy broadband internet access via Starlink's system in some places. You can buy, actually, as an individual, commercial Earth imagery from some of these companies, like Maxar, Black Sky, and Planet. But the overwhelming customer for these services are still governments. The US government is still by far the largest purchaser of commercial Earth imagery and communications services. And we're seeing this, for example, in the ongoing war in Ukraine, where the United States government is purchasing up large amounts of Earth imagery and providing some of that to the Ukrainian partners. And the government of Ukraine is itself benefiting from Starlink's broadband services. So commercial operators are going to grow markets directly to individuals and groups, but governments are still above and beyond the largest clients for these services. And governments are also the place that regulates commercial space operators. The vast majority of regulation of space launch and the use of low Earth orbit especially is done by national level agencies, not the international organizations. The International Telecommunications Union assigns orbital slots at geostationary orbit, but not for low Earth orbit, at least not directly. So states are still really important in all of this. And I'll just conclude quickly by noting that above and beyond states and commercial operators, non-state actors like universities, academics, NGOs, and even individuals are also increasingly able to draw on these services because commercial operators do provide access to communications and Earth imagery, but also, the increasingly low cost of small satellites and the availability of more efficient launch, more affordable launch capabilities means that universities can put up their own satellites. That is not a huge percentage of the overall total right now, but it does mean that there are increasing opportunities for other actors to be involved. And this is enabling a wide range of activities, including vital scientific research, but also civil society monitoring of, for example, weapons development in North Korea, or Uyghur detention camps in China, or indeed the ongoing war in Ukraine. A huge amount of what we know is coming from satellite-enabled services. So I want to just conclude with the point that, really fundamentally, all of us are directly and indirectly reliant on space systems. And Sas made a really great point about this earlier, just recognizing that, like, you have a smartphone, you're interacting with satellites all through the day through GNSS systems, the global navigation satellites, so GPS or European Union Galileo and so forth. But we're also using satellites for environmental monitoring, weather forecasting, predicting agricultural yields, emergency response, and a huge array of other things like banking, and as I mentioned, telecommunications. So we're engaging with satellite systems all the time. So there's this huge proliferation of actors and activity, and I think it's something we have to come to grips with in its sort of security dimensions, something we're speaking about today, but also the broader kind of policy dimensions of how this will be regulated as we become increasingly cluttered up in orbit.
And Sas, do you have anything to sort of add to that about primary actors, and especially because you've got the state side of it being part of the military institution? How do you envisage how the RAF and Space Command interact with these commercial actors? Because it's obviously a partnership which needs to be developed in order for everyone to sort of prosper and get the most out of space. Absolutely.
Adam raises some really valid points, not least because of how your average human being is engaging with satellites and space-enabled tech multiple times a day, whether or not they recognize it. It can always be a little bit difficult, I think, to put forward the point from defense without people automatically assuming that you in defense possibly want peaceful use of space because we're a military force. But to that, I would add the stance very much that most spacefaring nations have is a spirit of cooperation within that domain. And, we look at how in a relatively short period of time, we've moved from the two main players in space when the space race first started all those decades ago. And now, any guess of number, depending on what your parameter is as to what makes a spacefaring nation, I would argue that you've probably got up to 190 plus nations that are interested in space. Whether or not they have the ability to build their own satellites or to launch their own satellites, I think the world more broadly has seen the benefit of a lot of space-enabled tech and information and systems in how, as Adam pointed out, that environmental monitoring, the ability to use that commercial imagery. So from the UK Space Command perspective, we talk a lot about own, collaborate and access. And that's, does the UK need a sovereign space capability all to itself? Or for the most part, are you looking at collaboration with other nations with regards to building something within that realm of cooperation? Or is it something that you're just looking to access? Those one-off purchases, again, as Adam highlighted, the US government being the largest purchaser of commercial imagery from space. And there's no doubt it gives you an element of observation on all things across the world that we might not necessarily have had a few decades previously. So I think useful for everybody, which is why there is so much interest in it.
Coming from a legal perspective, one of the key aspects of the law that we'll look at, certainly from an international law perspective, is the Outer Space Treaty. I'm going to give it its full title because it's not often referred to as that. It's often colloquially known as the Outer Space Treaty or even the OST. But the full title is the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. A very catchy title, which probably tells you why it's shortened down to the Outer Space Treaty. But I think that having that as a source of law at the international level is really important for this sort of conversation when we talk about who are the primary state and non-state actors. And I say that, and I give the background to what the treaty is and the fact that it's got 111 state parties to it. So these states have come together, states negotiated the treaty and consented to be bound by the obligations and have the rights that are expressed within it. So they've consented openly, voluntarily to say, well, as a matter of international law, this is what we all can agree to. And it includes all the major spacefaring nations. And it's quite an impressive treaty if you think about 111 states all coming together and saying, yep, we agree on these 17 different articles. And Article 1 of that treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, provides specifically that all states enjoy the right to access and use space. Most treaties would quite often say, well, the state parties, that is in this instance, the 111 states are going to agree to something. or be bound by something or have the right to something, but the Outer Space Treaty specifically says it's all states, whether they're state parties or not. And I think that's quite an important point to highlight when we're talking about the relevant actors in space. Again, going back to the full title, it's talking about the activities of states. So I think that's pretty relevant and worth highlighting when we talk about it. So who they are, but also who they might become, is very relevant to that. I think also returning to another specific legal point as well, and it draws on some of the figures that Adam provided, which are always interesting when you hear them about the percentage wise in terms of the states that have active registered satellites to them, or indeed what states are actively purchasing imagery or other products or services that are provided or enabled by space. Returning to that from a very legal perspective, well, the activities and practice of prominent states in a particular area is going to actually carry quite a bit of significant weight to it as well. So state practice is this concept in international law, and it's a fundamental component of it that allows for the development and interpretation of the law. So if you've got particular states that are particularly active and particularly prominent in a particular area, then what they do and what they say is going to matter quite important. So again, I probably wanted just to draw that out when we're talking about the primary state and non-state actors.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much to all of you for this magnificent grounding of who the actors might be in outer space. Moving on from there, if you are not a state and if you're not a multi-billion-dollar company, why is then having this conversation about peace in outer space important? Like, why is it important to me as a single student, as to Harry, to, well, you as well as individuals? Why do we need to have this conversation about why peace in outer space matters?
Sure, no problem. The conversation about space anyway is important, and we have already touched on it. There are those who work within space industry, whether that's from a military, a civilian, commercial perspective, who know it, love it, are involved in it and understand all of it. And then you have the remaining world of population, and you look at the role that popular science fiction has played in a lot of people's understanding of what space is all about. And if you're not careful, when you link that with the military, there is this real sense of, excuse the phrase, but sort of boots on the ground on the moon and physical fighting that might take place. And I think it goes back to a point I made earlier about people understanding the origin of so much of what they do in their daily life, and how much of that is facilitated by space in some way, shape, or form. And I think the points that Adam has already raised really valid with regards to all of those space systems. We use them, they help run our financial markets. We use them to get us from point A to point B. It is part of the PNT, the position, navigation, timing, GPS, Galileo, Beidou, call it what you want, the system itself. Those elements that allow us to do those financial transactions, that allow us to look at how some companies organize their logistics of getting delivery of a good that you've ordered on the World Wide Web that has been provided to you by space, that is delivered less than 24 hours later by somebody in a van who has used that same GPS system to work out how they get from the warehouse to your particular house or flat, and delivers those things that we now take for granted. The potential to not be able to get hold of something that they want 24/7, and how it's changed the way that we do our daily life shopping or how we access goods. And again, it's sort of fallen into our daily life, perhaps without a hugely conscious thought. So I think understanding that, and what happens if we don't have space for whatever reason, but we lose space for a day, and quickly how challenging our daily life could become, if not, I don't want to say impossible, but all of those things that we have taken for granted. I can't go and get cash out of my bank hole in the wall. I can't go and get petrol from a petrol pump. I can't do whatever I want to do on the World Wide Web. All of those things that you take for granted now, and how much that has been facilitated. So being able to continually have that access to space and space-enabled capability, and being able to ensure that those services are available to us whenever we want to have them, I think is central to how we all live our lives now, whether we're aware of it or not. So I think it's important, even those that wouldn't consider themselves to be space geeks or lovers of popular science fiction, probably have more involvement with space than they give themselves credit for. And that really, I think, is why it's so important that peaceful and responsible use of space should be central to any space user, whether that's a nation state. The comments that Stu made earlier with regards to what is considered to be people that have a valid and viable interest in the use of space. It's important to recognise also that I think the majority of spacefaring nations are committed to that desire to see space used in a peaceful manner, basically so that every nation, every individual is able to benefit from the technological capabilities that the domain provides. And I think we've seen a growing, in comparison to how we started back in the 50s, where it was that race, it was the conflict, the competition between the USSR at the time and the USA first, who was going to achieve these things. And now I think it has naturally become more international. It has become something that is for everybody as opposed to one or two particular nations. And I think most people have developed over the last couple of decades, in all honesty, that it's that state, I suppose, the approach of cooperation versus competition that is going to be more important.
I'd maybe just add a couple of things if I could. I would endorse everything that Sas just said, and also say that what strikes me about this is there's an inherent, I don't know if exactly tension is the right word, but let's use that. There's a sort of an inherent tension in the sort of the peaceful uses or peaceful purposes discussion, because Stu mentioned this already, the Outer Space Treaty or the OST. Many space lawyers argue that the peaceful purposes or ensuring peaceful uses of outer space is really the fundamental purpose of the Outer Space Treaty. And you can find this in various parts, but specifically in Article 4 that says that, the use of celestial objects, including the moon, must be exclusively for peaceful purposes. The treaty prohibits the stationing of weapons of mass destruction in outer space and the stationing of any type of weapon on celestial objects, but that leaves some exceptions. But more broadly, right, the idea of peaceful uses has been understood through state practice that Stu mentioned before as not prohibiting military uses of space for a variety of purposes on Earth that we've sort of discussed already, or potentially in other ways as well. And while we, I think quite rightly, want to focus on sort of peaceful, sustainable, safe, secure uses of the space environment, it's important to note that that doesn't preclude military operations or actors utilizing the space environment, right? So right from the beginning of the space age, pretty much as soon as Sputnik was launched, it was sort of acknowledged that because of orbital mechanics, the physics of it, spacecraft are going to have to be able to traverse around the Earth in a way that an aircraft would not be able to do. So a spacecraft, a satellite overflying national territory is not regarded as a violation of territorial sovereignty in the way that a spy plane would be. That was just accepted more or less unproblematically from early on in the space age. And similarly, largely due to forms of advocacy from the United States and Soviet Union, the international community tacitly and somewhat explicitly accepted equally that the military and intelligence agencies would be using satellites for purposes. And so there is this kind of complexity to the idea of peaceful uses. And I'd also just mention quickly that what strikes me as really interesting about the space age, and Sas is quite right, that there's this, our narrative of the space age is competition between the superpowers. And yet there's interesting forms of cooperation even then. So you can go back to the Apollo-Soyuz docking mission where the two space stations joined up in 1975. So this is a period of considerable tensions during the Cold War. 1979 and the initial creation of the COSPAS SARSAT system. So this is a system initially negotiated between Canada, France, United States, Soviet Union, I believe with some UK involvement as well, which was going to allow for the sharing of emergency response beacons and the transmission of those through any available satellite among those different countries, regardless of who operated the satellite. And even now, I mean, since the extension of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine in February, much was made about this, sort of the implosion of civilian cooperation at the International Space Station, and the head of Roscosmos, Dmitry Rogozin, making some really bombastic statements and indeed effectively holding about 34 OneWeb satellites hostage at their launch facility. And there was all sorts of comments about that this maybe the Russians would just stop using their part of the station to do orbital maintenance maneuvers for the space station. Well, that hasn't happened. The space station has continued to exist. It's an inherently interoperable system that couldn't exist if one of the partners withdrew, the United States or Russia, and indeed relying on contributions from a number of other countries as well. But there's indeed a lot of tension in that. So we might have noticed even just in the last few days, the Russian cosmonauts on the International Space Station were carrying, I believe, the flag of the self-declared Luhansk People's Republic and received a lot of international rebuke. So there's a lot of tension in this. But I would point out that interesting forms of cooperation that endure in space, even at times of considerable geopolitical tensions in other domains. That's not to say it's perfect, But there's this really fascinating, from my perspective, kind of political, but I think it's also, as we talked about earlier, the kind of the narratives of space and the ways in which these coincide with or sometimes diverge from narratives that are happening with similar actors on Earth. So that to me makes this just a really rich sort of area for discussion.
Thank you so much for that. Kind of feeding into that, when you talk about this is such a complex here on Earth and for the rest of us on Earth, it can seem very, very alienated, this concept of peace in outer space, even though you can sit us down and explain to us why the satellites are important in our everyday lives. But still, when you talk about peace in outer space and you relate it to peace on Earth, there is this feeling that, okay, there might be more important stuff to address on Earth compared to space. Whereas if you had to sell it to someone, that why does helping maintaining peace in outer space, how are you to link those two together? So even though it's deeply intertwined in our everyday lives, how does making sure that outer space is more peaceful promote or help peace on Earth?
I'd probably like to pick up on that narrative point a little bit further as well. The difference between perhaps the reality versus what the perception is. Inmarsat just published a report, a global report, I think it was actually earlier this month or last month, that was titled, "What on Earth is the Value of Space?" And as part of that, they surveyed 20,000 people across 11 countries, just asking some initial thoughts in relation to space. And some of the answers were probably slightly surprising in some regard. So when they asked the 20,000 people as to what did they think about when they thought of space, what did they associate with space? If I was to tell you that the report suggests that 21% of those would think of aliens and 8% of those would think of connectivity and communications by comparison, then I think that maybe speaks to some of the narrative issue that we've got. So when we talk about peace, I don't think we're talking about peace with aliens per se. I think we're probably talking more about other elements when we're talking about what the value is. And I think that narrative really plays into connecting the two. And the way that I always approach questions such as this and trying to think of a framework or understanding is really to think both from a practical and also from a legal perspective, to not think about space in isolation. And I think the previous comments, particularly by Sas as well, really draws that out. Thinking about them in isolation, both law and the practical sense, isn't helpful, because I don't think it helps with the framework. Activities in space will almost certainly always have a connection to the terrestrial activities. They're not really happening in isolation for any particular purpose. And I think it's that overarching context of the relationship between states will influence how states interpret certain activities as well. So if you have the view that the activities of one of your adversaries or a competitor in space, how you're going to perceive those activities or those actions is going to be very different potentially from the reaction that those exact same activities would have if it was one of your allies or partners that were carrying it out. And I think that's probably quite an important point from this narrative perspective as well. And that ability to undertake really any lawful activities in space, for instance, some of them have been mentioned, such as the Earth observation, satellite imagery being provided in relation to activities that are on the ground, then that's essential. That's the role that space is playing in helping maintaining peace, both in space and also in Earth. Think of it as one big part. There's 3 segments. We quite often get really focused on the space segment. That's the shiny satellites going in orbit. The link segment that communicates and provides the link between the ground segment and the space segment is really important. And having that framework, I think, is quite useful. A kind of key aspect of international law, and that applies to all states under general international law. So we're not here talking about specific space law, we're talking about the general international law. A key principle of the UN Charter, the United Nations Charter, which applies to 193 member states, is to resolve and settle international disputes by peaceful means. And Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty tells us that's applicable to space because it confirms that general international law, and it specifically mentions, including the UN Charter, applies to the conduct of activities in space. So that peaceful resolution that states should try and resolve their disputes through peaceful means certainly applies to space. It applies on the terrestrial level, but it also applies to space and Earth in the same way. And I think, again, trying to round all those together is ultimately trying to highlight that law does play a part, both general international law, but also then specific space law as well.
Yeah, the legal perspective is very interesting and important too. So you mentioned the Outer Space Treaty, and in terms of, if you are to link it to what's happening on Earth, do you find that states actually oblige by it? Do they regard it as many other international law, which I think we'll delve deeper into later on in the podcast, dynamic between Earth and space, and then the legal obligations in those terms?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's one that I think you can approach in a lot of different ways. There's lots of different perspectives that exist, both as to the substance of international law and also probably about the effectiveness of it, which I think you're touching on probably elements of both of those. And it's something that certainly I encounter, I think, from my perspective in conversations within the military sphere, where I think there's a lot of popular misconceptions about the Outer Space Treaty, for instance, that, well, it's outdated, it's not fit for purpose, it doesn't do the job that it was. How can a treaty that was negotiated and ultimately agreed in 1967, how can that have any relevance to today's world? The actors have changed so much, the activities have changed so much. How can it possibly have any sort of function? We need to go and try and create new law. We need to negotiate and get back down to the negotiating table and try and regulate these activities in a bit more detail. I think my view is, well, you can approach that question or thought in a number of different ways, but kind of touched on some of the points already, that it's actually probably quite an impressive treaty if you think about the number of state parties that exist. Could we get a treaty that gets such broad general principles? Could we get all the spacefaring states, the fact that there's a lot more of them now as well, but could we get them all around the table to agree on anything, never mind something of such a broad and detailed nature? That might be quite a difficult task in the current geopolitical climate. And then also it's trying to understand what's the treaty is achieving to do. Does the Outer Space Treaty claim to have all the answers and do all the heavy lifting when we're talking about peace? No, it doesn't, and it specifically doesn't set its remit as that. It's a treaty of 17 articles in total. It doesn't have any direct enforcement mechanism built into it. But what it seeks to do is not set out highly detailed prescriptive regulation. What it seeks to do is set out some broad principles for states to look to turn to. That makes it quite difficult when you're trying to apply broad principles to specific applications, specific activities, but they exist there as a framework for states to do. And it's not the only bit of law, going back to what I said earlier. I hope I've answered what you asked, but it was more just a journey to try and explain the broad perspectives there.
Yeah, no, thank you.
And I think sort of building off this, what happens when we do break down international law, so when states do move into weaponization of space assets, for example. I know there's been a few occasions where low orbit satellites have been shot down by various states. And sort of my question for you, Saz, is what issues does that arise if we do have full-blown conflict in space? What will that bring to me as an individual, to us as a world? Because I know there's things like the Kessler syndrome, where you have space debris creating more space debris and sort of spiraling out of control very quickly. So first, there's two parts to the question of what does conflict in space look like, and sort of how will that affect us? And yeah, why do we need to avoid that? Because obviously it could have big ramifications for us. But how does it affect Otilia, my mum, and me, opposed to the UK Space Command?
Sure. No, really valid question. And part of the challenge with that question is that I think if you asked any nation, not just the UK, it's quite difficult to determine what would kick off conflict in space, so to speak. Not least because it involves what your risk parameters are. Unless somebody has specifically launched something to take out one of your key national infrastructure, space satellite systems, and purposefully try to remove your access to space, I think that most people would agree that that's probably a fairly aggressive action that would require some sort of response. But if you look at some of the challenges that you have, if you're a space operator, and we speak quite regularly about space being a contested and congested and competed environment. The congestion comes from the number of operators, but it also comes from, as you rightly referred to, the level of debris that space operators are having to contend with on a daily basis. What one space operator might be comfortable with, somebody else is not. If you take out a commercial capability, is that more or less aggressive action than if you take out a national sovereign state capability? So it's been quite difficult. I think there's a lot of definitions and a lot of hard lines that a lot of nations are struggling to define at the moment. But for argument's sake and for the purpose of this discussion, we have entered into something that everybody agrees is a conflict in space. Why should your mum, why should the person sat next to you on the bus care about that? And I think it goes back to the points that we as a panel have already raised, is that humanity already has a significant reliance on space services. Our daily lives almost invariably are kind of reliant on satellites and systems in space throughout what we do. So any disruption to that leads to significant consequences for civilian, for commercial, and for economic activity. Not to mention, almost as an aside, but not to mention the armed forces' ability to undertake many of the defence tasks that we have. Going back to that, why should I care as an average human being on the planet? Part of the challenge, again, I think, is the fact that as large as space is, we as a human population are consistently looking to access and utilise the same orbit. Space at the end of the day is fundamentally, it's about physics. So most of the things that we want need to be placed in a similar location on orbit in space. So that then you've got your increased competition for that and the demand for that access. And that's only increasing, particularly when you look at the commercial aspects of creating those, the constellations of satellites, that all contributes towards it. So bringing physical conflict into space, I think, gives several dangers, not least, as you rightly referred to, the Kessler syndrome, that the potential for debris to impact upon debris, etc. So I think I'd need to double check on my maths, but there are hundreds of thousands of pieces of trackable debris in space, but hundreds of millions that are smaller than a centimetre. And all of those objects are travelling at tens of thousands of miles per hour, which already creates a really hazardous environment for those that are operating in space. You fall into another challenge there, which is, I think most people have recognised that space debris is a problem for which a solution needs to be found. And there's a number of commercial interests who have looked to develop capabilities that can take some of that debris out of consideration. So whether that's, you're looking at organizations that have built sort of a harpoon capability from one satellite to another. If you've got a satellite body or a rocket body or a piece of debris that you can't control anymore, send up a satellite, fires a harpoon into it, it can take it down into the Earth's atmosphere and burn up, and it reduces some of the debris problem. You've got the ability to launch a net at the same sort of thing, again, take it down into the Earth's atmosphere and burn up. You've got people who've come up with grappling arms to do exactly the same thing. But part of the challenge with space is understanding, I suppose, the intent that somebody has when they go up to do that. So you can pitch yourself as, I'm going to clean up all of the space debris and make it so that the whole domain is easier for everybody to operate within. But if you're of a mind to, you can look at that quite suspiciously, and you can be, well, if you can grab a dead rocket body or a piece of debris, then you can also get hold of my perfectly functioning satellite and take it out of consideration. That's a lot of money. Understanding the intent behind people's actions in space is also a contributing factor to that. But I think that kind of leads us into the threat picture, what gets us into a position where we might consider conflict in space in the first place. So the threat picture, that is what we understand to be malign activity with a serious intent to do harm against for now, let's just refer to the UK, but that assured access or freedom of action within the space domain, those threats are evolving all the time as well. So there are some nation states who appear to be actively pursuing hostile space capabilities. They test international agreements and they practice as they go about. And that was highlighted by the Russian direct descent anti-satellite test that they completed in late 2021. Again, they're not targeting other people's satellites. So there's a part of you that might think, why should I worry? They're using their own systems against their own systems. But that created debris, which almost impacted on human life because there were cosmonauts and astronauts in the International Space Station at the time. And it proved to be a fairly scary period of time for those that were on board the ISS. not knowing what pardon the use of the word, but the impact potentially could have been. And thankfully, it worked out. But it's that part of that evolving threat picture. And I go back to the comment that I made at the beginning about can be quite difficult because we don't necessarily have those agreed definitions, those agreed lines, what constitutes standard competitive behavior, what constitutes malign behavior. But it's got to the point where NATO even has confirmed that it recognizes that any attacks to or from or within space represent a clear challenge to the security of the alliance, and by that I mean the cooperation within NATO. And so that's been recognized. I don't know that means that there's any hard and fast answers, but it does mean that people are looking at that. And Stu and I happen to now work for one of those organisations that's looking to reduce the risk of escalation and miscalculation. And that, again, it goes back to that you remove or you reduce the chance of escalating into conflict when you are driven by a focus for cooperation and discussion and communication with your allies and with other international partners. And part of that is trying to come up with something about developing those rules and norms of behaviour so that the potential for conflict can be avoided or reduced where possible. I would finish that with the fact that conflict in space doesn't serve anybody's best interests. It has the potential to cause more significant effects, I think, than might have originally been intended by whatever started that off in the first place, whether we recognise it or not. And it's one of those things, you don't know what you've got until you've lost it. If we were to suddenly lose access to space and all of the benefits to modern life that brings, I hope that answers the question a little.
A great answer. And Stu, I'm going to ask you a legal question, actually. So we're talking about this ability to grab a satellite. Is there a difference between, for example, a state or an actor jamming one of the UK's satellites opposed to using projectile kinetic energy, which will make space debris? From a legal point of view, is that seen as a different act, or is it both seen as an attack on UK space assets? So is there a big difference because they're using sort of more benign methods of jamming or taking that satellite out of action?
I think in terms of how, and again, it goes back to probably a framework, broad principles approach to how international law works. And in this area, the key focus in relation to how you can categorise and then categorise activities, how you go about doing that is that there's recognised thresholds under international law. And Sas mentioned this, the fact that, well, there's not sometimes clear definitions. I think that's very true. In some cases, there probably would be real benefit to clear definitions. But international law quite often doesn't really define exactly what those definitions are. Sometimes that's a really good thing, sometimes that's a really bad thing. The reason why sometimes it's a really good thing is that it provides flexibility. So if we think about how long international law is developed on some of these thresholds that I mentioned, so the use of force, there's a prohibition against the use of force with some certain limited exceptions to that prohibition. So states shouldn't resort to using force in their international relations. That was codified and established in the UN Charter again following the end of World War II. But if we think about how that concept exists back in 1949 to how it exists now, having a strict definition and putting a barrier or framework around that definition back in 1949 would probably be very unhelpful in today's terms, because it wouldn't allow for the evolution and involvement, the interpretation to develop and move with the advancing technologies. These thresholds exist, but they exist in a way that allows for the development and application in lots of different areas. And I think a lot of cyber probably was the domain. When we talk about cyber, we talk about how those effects and how they're delivered produces very different ideas. So if you're talking about how a cyber effect is delivered, it's probably by someone pressing a keyboard. That's not a particularly violent act. It's not resulting in a forceful act. You could tap your keyboard really heavily, but I don't think that quite reached the threshold that we're talking about. So what international law does and what's that debate started to do was say, right, we've got these rules, but how we think about them probably needs to be different. So we don't think about the act per se, we think about the effects and we think about the consequences. So I think when we go back to what your question was as to, well, does it really matter how that effect's delivered? international law, broadly speaking, there may be some exceptions, there may be some prohibitions that exist, but broadly speaking, it will look at the effects, it will look at the consequences to work out what that threshold is, whether that threshold's reached. And when you get that threshold reached in certain circumstances, then it might provide some response options for you. So effects and consequences is the framework to think through.
So I just wanted to add a couple of things. First off, I'll speak up in defense of international law as perhaps the most interesting part of this whole discussion, because for precisely the kinds of questions of breadth versus specificity that abound in international law and the law of armed conflict, for example, the area I'm most familiar with is rife with these kinds of things, context-specific questions. I wanted to throw out, maybe just building on both Sas and Stu's comments, a couple of sort of broader, from the IR perspective, on how to think through problems of things like deterrence and signaling and security dilemmas and all of this. And of course, the general solution typically in international relations is to say, well, we need more transparency and more dialogue. But just to throw out a couple of sort of ways in which there's really like enduring ambiguity, in my view, in some of these things. And one would be just sort of, if, let's just say, a spacecraft were to go offline, depending on the technology used against it, it's not necessarily the case that one could easily attribute the cause of that, right? So a direct descent kinetic kill missile is pretty obvious, and it's very easy to detect, relatively speaking, and you could very quickly attribute where that missile had come from. So attribution to a hostile actor would be pretty straightforward. On the other end of the spectrum, a cyber attack might be detected, but it may be much more difficult to determine precisely where it came from. And we can look back to the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine around the 24th of February, and with Viasat, commercial satellite telecommunications operator, reported a large-scale attack against its network. Now, it didn't attack the satellites. It actually, as far as I understand, attacked the downlink and ended up bricking the modems of individual users of Viasat, making the modems used in their homes inoperable. That has been attributed, by my understanding, to some Russian forces, but that kind of attribution may be more difficult in some circumstances. Another difficulty is just the deliberate ambiguity that major military space powers have with respect to their military and intelligence satellites. These are not recorded in the UN register, even though officially governments are required to report and record at least the basic parameters of all spacecraft put in orbit. The United States, for example, doesn't typically include information on their clandestine satellites. That can be a problem, because if one of those satellites were to become inoperative from an adversary's point of view, it may not be clear which ones are which. So if the hostile power were attempting, for example, to target a secure American communication satellite out of geostationary orbit, there might be ways of figuring out which one is which, but they definitely don't want to hit one of the nuclear command and control satellites, or a satellite that's principally used for nuclear command and control or missile early warning, because that might be interpreted, understandably, as the prelude to a nuclear attack. And these kind of things, build into debates about deterrence and the role of space systems in deterrence and stability. The last thing I'd just briefly add is that the war in Ukraine has also revealed, as we've spoken about a little already, the entwinement of commercial and military and intelligence capabilities, and the increasing ways in which governments are utilizing commercial services, and indeed in some cases commercial satellites are operating both as a platform for secure military communications, for example, and a civilian signal, sometimes at the same time, sometimes separately. Typically, those signals would be separated for secure and insecure communications, but there's an increasing entwinement between commercial and state operations. And again, from my perspective, that introduces another form of challenge in determining a hostile act, whether it has been an intentional hostile act. So something that colleagues and I are starting to work on more is to think through the implications for commercial operators in providing services to governments that may be involved in an armed conflict. So, for example, if SpaceX is providing broadband communications to one side in an ongoing armed conflict, and we might all think that's a perfectly appropriate thing to do, but from my perspective, makes it pretty clear that SpaceX is no longer a civilian entity, at least insofar as it relates to that armed conflict. So would that satellites with the Starlink constellation be fair game for an attack by the other side in that armed conflict? Well, Stu is the expert from the international law perspective, but it certainly, at minimum, to my mind, raises some really important questions about the involvement, the ways in which commercial operators are increasingly going to be implicated in armed conflicts in ways that they aren't going to be comfortable with. And I think that's a conversation that is ongoing, but needs to be ongoing to a greater degree. So simply just to add on to these great comments that have already been made, of like, there's a lot of inherent ambiguity that comes from these things, partly by design, partly by the nature of the limits of what we can know about what's happening in orbit. And what worries me from a kind of conflict escalation perspective is that without good channels of communication. There is this risk, as Sas pointed out, whether inadvertent or unnecessary forms of escalation, because our ability to correctly interpret the actual nature of an event and the intention behind it can be limited. And that's where I think another way in which international relations, international law, and scientists can actually speak in quite productive dialogue to better understand both the orbital environment and the ways in which channels of communication and diplomacy can be improved, alongside, in my view, a need for enhancing rules and standards and norms around what counts as responsible behavior, which I would just briefly add as I conclude that the UK is really a leader in that area in promoting new ideas and initiatives on responsible behaviors in space, specifically on security. And I think that's been really welcome.
Great minds and all that. That was exactly the point that I was going to make. You did far more eloquently than I was, but it was about that, the perspective of attribution. We refer to a threat spectrum. Do you have a temporary or a permanent effect on space-based capability? Part of the challenge is that you can have a problem with your handheld radio, you can have a problem with your GPS, you can have all of these problems, and it could be adversarial activity, it could be solar weather, it could just be a very poor piece of equipment. And determining which one of those three things it is, when you get to the right-hand scale of permanent removal of the space capability, it's generally a little bit easier probably to place that attribution. But some of the subtleties of effects that you can have do make it incredibly difficult. I think really valid point that Adam has made also on the occasion of using those commercial entities to provide information or access to communications or imagery that can help one side or another. We, the Western, the developed world, NATO, will have a perspective of how we feel about those communications being provided to Ukraine. If you're on the other side, whoever that might be, you see somebody else facilitating your adversary. So then it is very difficult and really challenging. And I think probably more so for space than I would suggest it ever has been terrestrially. And I just a little vignette, like sort of unintended consequences. And this is an area that I find quite fascinating is, if somebody jams GPS, we go back to that attribution and understanding intent. And it's an anecdotal piece. Like there is a story about long distance lorry drivers who had GPS jammers so that they would turn them on if they fancied taking an hour and a half for lunch instead of an hour. But they would invariably park up in a big open area that allowed a large truck to pull over. And anecdotally, this was done quite regularly in front of an airport. And then the inbound aircraft were reporting problems as they were coming into land. And it's somebody has taken an action that doesn't necessarily have any malign intent behind it, other than to have a longer lunch break. But then there are repercussions to that. And that is also part of the challenge, is in understanding any action that you take, what are the full consequences of those actions? And did you intend for all of those actions to happen as a knock-on effect, etc.? And I don't have the answers to that, but I do find it a really interesting perspective to look at. And so yeah, Adam's comments were great, really fascinating.
I could just pop in with a final rebuttal, and it's just to say I think it is really important, certainly from a legal perspective, that one of the first questions, and it goes back to my earlier point really about things don't happen in isolation in space. And I think it's really important that we understand what bodies of law we're applying to particular contexts. So the overarching context of the relationship between states, for instance, if we're talking about it in the state realm, is understanding, well, what is the context? Is in law generally looks at this quite a binary way. Policy might have a slightly different view of it, but certainly coming at it from a very legal perspective is very binary. You're either in the context of an ongoing armed conflict or you're not in an armed conflict. It's very binary. There's different thresholds, but generally speaking, is there been a resort to armed force between states at the international level? And if it is, then you're in an ongoing armed conflict. And the important point there from a legal point is, well, you're then applying a different body of law. The law that will apply in that context is the law of armed conflict, specialised body of law that's clearly applicable to space. And I think it's generally, or certainly widely accepted, that body of law does apply. But the considerations and factors that you look to, and the thresholds and the effects and the consequences, and all your considerations are very different under that body, under that overarching context, than it would be the other side, which would be where we were talking about this peace paradigm all the way up to short of armed conflict, if there's not been an ongoing armed conflict. And it's very different considerations that apply.
That is all incredibly fascinating, and in lines with what you have been saying about the narratives about outer space and all these shared ideas and norms. Then a question for us as young IR scholars often lands on make it inclusive and make sure that everyone is offered a seat at the table. So in terms of that, it often seems to us that outer space becomes this battlefield or playfield for actors with either a lot of military capabilities or Western states. My question is more in terms of how do we make outer space a more level playing field, especially in regards to global South countries who might have a less obvious interest in outer space. Adam, if you could offer some perspectives on that from an IR perspective.
I'm going to try to be really brief because I know we're coming to the end of our time. I think the first thing I would say is just to recap and agree with many of the comments that have been made. There is a growing recognition internationally that all states, all peoples are implicated by space activities. It seems to me that that is really widely understood at an international level. Of course, the degree of state capability when it comes to space is very unevenly applied at the moment. But international laws we've also spoken about is premised on peaceful uses of outer space. I'd argue it has a premise of inclusivity, especially of cooperation built in, especially to the Outer Space Treaty. And you could go further with that. You could say, for example, if you look to the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, they have a very prominent discussion on their website and in their work on how space supports the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I think there's a broader recognition that space is really important and is important to everyone, even for those states or peoples that may not be themselves launching rockets or operating wide constellations of satellites. But you can go further than that. I mean, you can see, I think, a really impressive expansion of space activities and operations in the global South. Thinking of in Africa and Southeast Asia, Latin America, there's a lot going on. And there's a lot of really interesting developments, particularly on the civilian commercial space side of things, much less so I would suggest in the most cases in terms of military and intelligence uses. But I want to just quickly challenge the premise of the question just a little bit. In the second part of the question about leveling the playing field, and my suggestion there would be, I'm not sure that that should be the objective if we interpret that as meaning everybody sort of has the same amount of stuff. I'd want to suggest that much like how on the military side, we're interested in assessing the impact of particular actions, maybe rather than just the technologies themselves, we should here be thinking about the benefits that can come from space operations rather than encouraging a kind of endless proliferation of space launch and space assets. And just to think of this really briefly, on the one hand, I'd suggest the proliferation of military space capabilities, especially kinetic, kill, destructive anti-satellite technologies, but I'd even go further to say the proliferation of laser systems or forms of radio frequency or microwave interference or hacking and jamming and so forth, all of that stuff is bad. So the more states that have that doesn't help us. In fact, it's antithetical to a sustainable space environment. But even if we think about the benign civilian systems, and we've talked already about debris, we're facing a really serious challenge in the coming decades. We have about 5,000 active satellites in orbit now. If you look at the international regulatory filings, there are proposals for hundreds of thousands of satellites. Rwanda alone has been the licensee for a company from America called eSpace with a proposal for 300,000 small satellites. Now, that's not going to be realized in all likelihood, but what we're seeing right now is a set of commercial actors working through governments to try to build out big spectrums to sort of, if you like, claim some of this orbital space. We can't have all of those satellites on orbit for reasons we've spoken about already. We don't know what the carrying capacity of Earth orbit is. Scientists have estimates, but it's a very complicated question. But what we do know is it's not infinite. And so what we have to worry about are both the sustainability of operations on orbit, but also the impact on Earth. So satellites that come back down towards Earth to burn up, they don't disappear. Their mass is converted into very small particles of aluminum and other materials, and that has an unknown effect on the upper atmosphere. We're not sure whether that will be negative or positive in terms of reflecting solar radiation and so forth. But we do know that it's happening and will happen at a greater scale as more and more objects burn up. But some of those larger objects, particularly large rocket bodies, won't burn up entirely and will fall back to Earth and have the potential to impact human populations. My colleagues at the Outer Space Institute have done some really interesting research arguing that there's a distributional effect that global south states, particularly those that are equatorial or equatorial adjacent, have a much higher probability of an impact from a returning rocket body. And given that a large number of the big cities of the world are located in that band, that they argue there's a distributional effect where wealthy Western countries, in particular in countries like China, are putting most of the stuff up into orbit, but the risk of things re-entering is borne by global south populations. So just to sum up briefly, increasing the number of launches, in my view, is not the way to get us towards equitable and inclusive outcomes. I think there's a couple of things that can be done. One is about promoting more responsible behaviors. We've discussed this a little bit, and there's a lot of diplomacy ongoing. And this is something, by the way, that global south states have made really important contributions to. Global south states have had important role in some of the international space diplomacy. My suspicion is that you're going to see them become even more vocal in coming years in some of these dialogues. So far at the open-ended working group on responsible behaviors that the UK was a champion of, a number of global south states have spoken, but the various entities, the non-aligned movement, for example, has been an advocate for banning forms of anti-satellite weaponry in the past. It would also, I think, be beneficial to, rather than encourage a model where everybody is trying to have their own indigenous launch capabilities, their own satellite production, that we look to civilian and commercial partnerships to draw benefits off of existing systems and a modest growth in systems, rather than having a sort of unregulated environment where everybody tries to put their own systems up. My view is that's economically inefficient, unsustainable, and environmentally very dangerous as well. So I just sort of conclude there that, to my mind, the inclusivity aspect is more about the benefit that can be drawn from space systems. But those benefits are only going to remain available to us if we ensure that the environment itself is being protected in a safe and responsible way. That has a military and security dimension. We've spoken about this, but it also has a commercial dimension in trying to ensure that the regulation of commercial space operations, especially these mega constellations of satellites and the associated launches, are done in a way that is responsible, both in terms of ensuring that we don't overpopulate the orbital environment and that we don't pollute both the Earth atmospheric environment and the orbital environment, making that area unsustainable going forward.
If I could perhaps just expand on a point that Adam's raised a couple of times, but I think it is really important, particularly when we're talking about this inclusivity. And I think an important aspect to inclusivity is also about making, Adam spoke there about the benefits, and I think that is a really valid point. But I think going back to some of the points that have been raised already, it's also about making states and indeed their populations aware of the importance of space and the role that it plays in modern life, and how disruption to space, whether from hazards such as space weather or whether that be threats such as human-made debris, is going to impact upon our daily lives and also the economic prosperity. And just expanding slightly on what Adam's mentioned a couple of times, because I think it is really important, it's the work that's ongoing at the moment in the United Nations First Committee, where that open-ended working group has been convened to discuss this issue of responsible space behaviours. I think this work, led in the UK by our Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, is to generate a discussion about how states might minimise the risk of miscalculation and misunderstanding. And looking at it through an inclusivity point of view, the fact that it's an open-ended working group, I think, is important, rather than a smaller group of selected nations, means that all states have an opportunity to participate. And I think those states that are sponsoring the resolutions to convene that open-ended working group very much hope to make it as inclusive as possible. I think that's where they see the real value as being, to make sure that states have at least some awareness and appreciation of activities connected to space, but then also understand why they matter, which touches on Adam's point about the benefits as well, I think. So I just wanted to re-emphasize it because Adam raised it. I think it's a really important one.
Definitely, and very interesting points and interesting sides too in terms of what is happening in outer space.
But I think the last question, as this is the Visualising War and Peace podcast, is quite an important one as well. And it's just, how do we visualize peace in space, or just space in general as a concept, when it's so large, it's so alien, and it is quite literally so far away? How do we best sort of visualize space as it's for individuals? And I'll sort of open that up to anyone who wants to take that as the first answer.
You say space is very far, and in a sense it is. But the lowest possible orbits are something like 160 kilometers above our heads. And a lot of the operational satellites that we're utilizing on a daily basis are somewhere in the neighborhood of about 400 to 500 kilometers above our head. Well, that's actually not that far. I don't have off the top of my head a quick estimate of what it would mean to go 160 kilometers from where you are now, but let's say it's well within the boundaries of England, right? You could go from London 160 kilometers north and you haven't gone all that far. So it is far, but in one sense, I think the visualizing comes from recognizing that when we start thinking about the volume of space, it's absolutely enormous. And of course, the distances are ultimately infinite. But right now, humanity is using a very, very narrow sliver of space for almost everything we do. We're starting to talk more and more about missions back to the moon, eventually to Mars. We have, of course, sent deep space probes, but those are on one-way trajectories. The passes past Venus and other places, outer solar system, those aren't coming back, right? So most of what we do happens very close to home. And I think remembering that is actually quite important because it can feel so far and so overwhelming in terms of the scale. But much of what we're doing is actually really not that far overhead. I mean, you can see at the right times of day, at the right time of dusk, you can see satellites overhead. So thinking of it in those terms, I think can be beneficial.
I think that's a really valid frame of reference that Adam's just raised there. I was hesitant to answer the question because it is such an overwhelming question anyway. And for people for whom space is a new thing to be considering, it can be so overwhelming that it's almost impossible to think about. And so this whole idea of visualizing peace, it's hard enough to visualize what space looks like. But Adam's point about actually some of those distances are really short. I think what I would add to that is that where they are really short, you might not live in Westminster right now, but there's a lot of stuff going on in London. If you take yourself outside of London, 160 odd kilometers, do you still have a desire to understand and know where the challenges and issues are 160 kilometers away from where you live on the ground right now? You do, and it can be overwhelming. And I think one of my favorite stories, my friend has a son who in the last couple of years has become massively interested with all things space. He loves looking at the apps that you can get on the phone, funny enough, about being able to look at the night sky and look at the constellations and the moon. And he said to me, Sas, I love space. It's so exciting. He said, but it also scares me a little because it is so big. He's 10 years old, and it's like quite a deep thing to say, but I think it's very true and valid to this particular question. It's a hard thing to do because it's quite difficult to get people to understand what it means to them personally. And so if they can't think of a reason why it matters to them, it's quite easy to park and not think about it.
My final thought would probably come from the perspective of being a practitioner within the Royal Air Force. And I think as a comparison where providing legal advice in relation to air activities, you can see them with the naked eye. We have a lot of sophisticated products that have been developed to explain how air operations might be delivered and how they might work. We can use maps to show exactly where they would be overhead in relation to aviation. And we're dealing with a community that has existed since the Royal Air Force was established back in 1918. So we've got a bit of history in terms of understanding. We've got detailed practitioners who, if you pardon the pun, literally live and breathe aviation. If we then compare that to the space community within the MOD, then it's a smaller pool of people. It's probably not got as much deep experts. It's really hard to create products to explain equivalent things that they'll understand. And then even when they do, they love an analogy. So they'll try and say, okay, let's imagine that this is an aircraft. Let's imagine this is a maritime vessel, which is helpful to some extent, but then certainly from a legal perspective, it introduces a whole lot of complex issues because space doesn't operate in the same way that it does for aviation and maritime, for example. You can end up fighting the analogies rather than actually just trying to get to the heart of the problem. So I don't offer how we best visualize space. I would just emphasize that there's probably quite a lot of work to be done in that.
Thinking about your young 10-year-old friend who's all mad about space and is looking to the future of it, what message or sort of advice would you give to every citizen when they're thinking about space and how it's going to evolve in the future?
My one for this is quite simple. Understand what it is that space does for you as an individual on a daily basis. And then from there, work out how much you want to care about it.
Yeah, I'd just add that we've talked a lot in the podcast about the ways in which human populations are implicated by space technology and inclusivity being an important aspect. I would just add that There's lots of ways to be involved in these issues if one were so minded. This goes everything from hobbyists who use telescopes and other technologies in their backyard to identify and search for satellites and have private shared networks among friends of tracking satellites around the world, to learning more about the night sky, up to being involved in things like open source intelligence work that relies on satellite data and being an advocate, whether that's uncovering human rights abuses or deforestation. There's people that are doing this just in their spare time. Of course, also in conjunction with lots of experts. But finally, even though individuals don't go and negotiate treaties, there's lots of ways to be involved in advocacy, lots of ways to be involved in contributing to the global climate around these issues that we've spoken about. And so I think the message would be for students, for folks just listening in, whether they're at university or not, whether they're students at the University of St. Andrews or any other university, or simply just interested in these issues, is that there are ways to be involved. And that can range across a variety of being a hobbyist right to seeking to contribute to international civil society discussions. There are groups like the Outer Space Institute that I'm affiliated with, based in Canada, but around the world, that helps to try to advocate on behalf of certain issues and that occasionally do open letters that individuals can sign as well. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done, and it's just about finding out the things that interest you or impact you that you want to be involved in. Just because it's a technical area, both scientifically, legally, and in policy terms, doesn't mean that it excludes individual involvement in a variety of ways.
I think the final thought I'll add is probably just bringing different perspectives really enriches the discussion. So bring a perspective regardless of what it is, because all thoughts, all views are going to play a really important part regardless of what they are.
Yeah, wonderful. So I think that is a good note to end on. So thank you so much for taking your time today. And it was an honor meeting you all and listening to your perspectives on it.
You're very welcome. I've really enjoyed the discussion today. So thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thanks all. Great.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure.
I'm going to jump back in now just to say a big thank you also from me, Alice. Thank you to Adam, Sas and Stuart for their fascinating insights into this complex topic, and also to Harris and Otilia for their excellent hosting. And thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed that conversation on peace in space as much as I did. You can read a bit more about peace in space in our virtual Museum of Peace, which also has lots of other fascinating exhibits to explore. Just search for St. Andrews Peace Museum or follow the links in our episode notes. And if you have any questions about anything you've heard today or any comments, please do get in touch with us to keep the conversation going. You can follow us on social media, just search for Visualising Peace, or contact us directly by emailing us at vispeace@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafia Gertin. Thank you for listening.